BBC Two now continues to chart the history of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Tonight's messengers from Moscow find Stalin with his eye on Mao's China.
In December 1949, Stalin was to be 70 years old. Just a couple of months earlier, in October 49, Germany had been divided. NATO blocked Stalin's power to the west. But that same month, the People's Republic of China, Communist China, was founded. Stalin saw the chance of a new power game in the East. That December of 49, the world's communist leaders were invited to the Soviet capital for the birthday party. All Moscow awaited the guest of honor, the hero of the Chinese Revolution, Mao Zedong. But Stalin had plans for him. And within 6 months, those plans were to lead to war in the East. On December the 2nd, 1949, Mao Zedong left Beijing to make the 4,000-mile rail journey to Moscow. He was 56 years old. It was the first time in his life that he had left China, and it was to be the only time that he met Stalin.
As a counselor of the embassy, I accompanied Chairman Mao to the border, and when the train left Beijing, the pipes were frozen, and it was very uncomfortable to continue the journey further northwards without the heating. And Chairman Mao didn't feel himself very comfortable during the whole journey. He practically didn't sleep.
On the second day of his journey, Mao reached Manchuria, northeastern China. He was greeted at the hotel by a sight that displeased him.
When I was in China myself in 1950, I was sleeping in that hotel, and I saw it myself. What was before the eyes of Mao Zedong? A huge portrait of Stalin in the uniform of Generalissimus, and a very small portrait of Mao Zedong. He refused to spend the night there, and he went to his train.
There had been bad blood between the two leaders for 20 years. For Stalin, Mao was too independent. So the Soviet leader had tried to plant his own men at the top of the Chinese Communist Party. Mao respected Stalin. He had no reason to trust him. But after decades of fighting, Mao had triumphed. From Berlin to Beijing, the map was red, and the West was fearful. Yet the communist bloc wasn't as united as it looked.
I think Mao Zedong coming by the end of 49 to Moscow, he was not only nervous, but he was afraid, because he was afraid of Stalin. And Stalin was also nervous and suspicious of Mao Zedong.
For Stalin, the People's Republic of China was an opportunity, but also a problem. China was too vast to be a Soviet satellite, but he certainly didn't see it as an equal partner. Stalin didn't come to the station to greet Mao. But in his place, he sent the whole of his Politburo, led by his loyal henchman, chairman of the Council of Ministers, Molotov. On the day of Mao's arrival, the Soviet press didn't call him Comrade Mao. He was just plain Mr. With Mao were just 3 companions. The last survivor of that select group is his personal interpreter, Shi Jie. He denies that Mao feared Stalin.
不会怕，第一他是不会怕，怀疑是没有什么怀疑的，就是说2个人能谈拢谈不拢。斯大林的想法，他有他的想法，这能不能够沟通？他不愿意在这个问题上花费功夫。
For decades, there have been rumors about this meeting. Some say that Stalin humiliated Mao, keeping him waiting for days. Mikhail Kapitsa was part of the Soviet interpreting team at the talks. Over the next 4 decades, he played a greater role in shaping Soviet policy towards China than anyone else. He denies that Mao received an unfriendly reception in Moscow.
Molotov told him, "You rest, please, and Stalin will be waiting for you at 6 o'clock. I underline that, because there has been a lot of misinformation in the world that Stalin didn't receive Mao for many days. Nonsense."
Shi Jie was the main translator at the talks. He agrees with Kapitsa that at the start, Stalin didn't bully Mao. The Soviet leader's plan began with a smile. At 6 o'clock that evening, the Chinese were brought to Stalin's office in the Kremlin.
他这个一看见了毛泽东，他2个手抓住毛泽东，哦，他是看过来看过去，他说你还年轻，是毛泽东，年轻，身体健康。毛泽东比斯大林高，又胖又个儿大，斯大林这样子看看是你还年轻，还中国人们有没有胡子嘛？那不年轻。
With the pleasantries over, Stalin made his apology for 20 years of bitterness.
The first remark Stalin said when Mao came, "We have probably caused you a lot of trouble. Beg your pardon." This was very important.
但是毛泽东想说的话不是这个，毛泽东回答的马上回答。 毛泽东说：“我是受打击、受排挤的人，在中国党里受打击、受排挤的人。这什么意思呢？就是莫斯科培养出那批教条主义者，同他来捣乱。斯大林是说的，既往不咎，胜利的就是一切，胜利就是一切， 谁能够责怪这个胜利嘛？所以你是胜利者，我不怪你，你不能够责怪胜利的，就是这样。受人的不受谴责的，斯大林的话。
Stalin illustrated his belief that the ends justify the means in the negotiations that followed. To win Mao's trust, he ordered the names of Chinese who'd been spying for the Soviets to be handed over to the new communist authorities in Beijing. The Soviet interpreter at these secret talks reveals what happened.
Были составлены списки агентов, подлежащих передаче. На каждого из них были составлены небольшие справки. На некоторых на одном листе, на некоторых, может быть, 1,5 листа. И эти справки были переданы руководству китайской внешнеполитической разведки. Но, конечно, разведчикам, профессионалам, у которых находились на связи эти люди, было трудно. Трудный был момент переживать, потому что с некоторыми из них ведь работали многие годы, можно сказать, десятилетия.
It was a death sentence for hundreds of Chinese, many of whom had served Stalin for decades. Mao had some shot and others sent to labor camps.
That was, I don't know. On the one hand side, it was very noble. But you cannot be noble if you kill another man. It was horrible. I know many of these people. I worked with them. Many of them were my friends. It's horrible.
In the week of Mao's arrival in Moscow, in every communist country, adulation had been decreed for the man Soviet propaganda called the father of the world's toiling masses. And occasionally, the greatest genius of all times. But back in Moscow, Stalin was finding the first stage of his plan tough going. Mao was cannily playing on his anxieties.
Stalin 呢是开门见山，就是我们中苏之间要学有什么，要权力前进有什么东西，毛泽东不愿意说。不愿意说，毛泽东光说这个，要搞个什么东西，这个东西既好看又好吃。
Afterwards, we understood that very beautiful and very tasty is a treaty of friendship and alliance.
14 февраля в Москве был подписан договор о дружбе, союзе и взаимопомощи между Союзом Советских Социалистических Республик и Китайской Народной Республикой, явившийся замечательным вкладом в дело мира и безопасности народов.
The deal may have looked beautiful, but it wasn't tasty to the Chinese. It had taken 2 difficult months to negotiate. Mao, in the end, had signed up for a 30-year mutual defense pact, but he didn't feel bound by it.
毛主席就是这样的说的，他的意思，签中条约，签你5年、10年、20年、30年都可以，我不管你。但是呢，不能够比这个东西把我的手收回去。这什么意思？你写30年、写50年，我什么时候要发的，就不要了。 我要推翻就推翻了。
Stalin had driven a hard bargain. The first stage of his plan demanded a strong Soviet presence in Manchuria, the industrial heartland of China, which the Soviets had occupied at the end of the Second World War. Stalin held on to the strategic railway links, the ports and key industries. And he offered the Chinese less aid than he'd recently given to Poland. Mao accepted the treaty terms out of weakness. After decades of war, China was exhausted, and his enemies were still at large. But when Mao returned to Beijing, his feelings became clear.
The Chinese agreed to the Russian demands. I don't think they were really happy about that. I don't think whether it was a real necessity for Stalin at that time to insist on such concessions which could remind the Chinese on other foreign imperialist actions of the 20th and 19th century.
Just 4 months later, in June 1950, communist North Korean troops invaded South Korea. But ever since the war, there's been controversy over whether Stalin started it. It's a vital issue, because the West concluded from the Korean War that the Soviets would use any means to expand their power unless confronted by an equal power. Now new evidence is laying the controversy to rest. The evidence begins with a top-secret telegram from the Soviet ambassador to North Korea. It reported a conversation with North Korea's leader, Kim Il-sung. Stalin received it while Mao was still in Moscow.
Shtikov to Stalin, 15th January 1950. Kim Il-sung insisted on making a personal report to Stalin for permission to advance from North Korea on South Korea. He was in a state of intoxication and talked in a very agitated manner.
Within a fortnight, Stalin had agreed to the proposition.
J. Stalin to Shtikov, 30th January 1950. Such a major task needs preparation. It should be organized so that there is no great risk. Agree to accept.
Those 3 words demonstrate that Stalin gave permission for the war. Does that mean he started it? The telegrams make it look as if an enthusiastic Kim Il-sung persuaded a cautious Stalin. Yet documents can't tell the whole story.
Идея, которую высказывают некоторые исследователи, что Ким Ир Сен вдруг сам проявил инициативу, что он хочет воевать и с помощью силы объединить Корею, это идея, которая не соответствует действительности. Сталин полностью контролировал ситуацию.
Colonel Korotkov has made a special investigation of the war over the past 30 years. In his view, you can't understand the documents unless you know how Stalin's control systems worked.
Таким образом, не сам Ким Ир Сен выдумывал эти, так сказать, предложения, отрабатывал. Они заранее готовились с участием советских специалистов. Советские специалисты сами не могли посылать Сталину что-то, делайте то-то. Через Ким Ир Сена все это делалось. Ким Ир Сен не мог самостоятельно, independently, сделать ни одного шага, потому что вся его деятельность находилась под постоянным контролем советских представителей и агентов.
Stalin had pushed Kim Il-sung into the limelight just a year earlier. One moment he'd been a captain in the Soviet army. The next, he had all power over 9 million North Koreans. For Stalin, Kim Il-sung was a pawn, while Korea was a vital square on the board. Stalin had just strengthened Soviet influence over Manchuria through the treaty with Mao. Manchuria bordered on Korea. At the end of the Second World War, Korea had been divided between the Soviets and Americans. But now the Americans were withdrawing from the South. If Stalin could add a Soviet Korea to a Soviet-dominated Manchuria, he'd have an arm lock on China. And he'd keep the Americans permanently out of Asia. He'd dominate the East. On June the 25th, 1950, the North Koreans launched the attack. But Stalin was worried about the American reaction. So the Soviets tried their best to hide the fact that they were central to the North Korean war machine, and they kept the secret for 40 years. Colonel Alexander Orlov was in Soviet military intelligence in Korea during the war. Recently, he's worked with the government commission declassifying secret documents about the war.
Все военнослужащие были переодеты в китайскую форму без знаков различия. Советники в Корее ходили в гражданском. Были запрещены всяческие контакты советских людей, советских военнослужащих с американскими пленными. И по радио в кабинах пилотов в русской транскрипции были написаны китайские или корейские команды, которые нужно было произносить. Но это, конечно, сразу было нарушено. И радиообмен велся на русском языке.
In the first 6 weeks of the war, the North Koreans swept over most of the country. US and Allied forces fighting under the United Nations flag were swiftly landed and set up a pocket in the southeast. Then in September 1950, US forces made a daring landing at Incheon. It was the turning point. The UN armies started to advance rapidly towards the Chinese-Korean border. Within 3 months of the start of the war, Stalin was facing complete defeat. He hesitated over what to do. One plan was to order the commander of Soviet Far Eastern forces stationed near the Korean border, General Rodion Malinovsky, to attack the UN forces in Korea, with the risk of setting off a world war between the Soviet bloc and the West. At that time, First Lieutenant Korotkov was political assistant to Malinovsky.
Я вспоминаю, как в разговорах, я там общался с руководством, бывал все время, ходила такая фраза, сказанная Малиновским. Если бы нам позволили, то в течение нескольких дней от войск ООН на Корейском полуострове только пух да перья полетели. Ничего бы не осталось. Этой фразой он выражал и готовность действовать, и уверенность в том, что мы там решим проблему, если только Сталин разрешит.
In Moscow, Stalin's indecision continued for some days. In early October 1950, he sent a crisis telegram to Mao. Third World War looked imminent.
Should we fear this? I think not, because together we shall be stronger than America, England, and the other capitalist states. Without Germany, which cannot now aid the USA, they do not represent a serious military power. If war is inevitable, then let it be now, and not in a few years' time, when Japanese militarism will be restored as an ally of the USA.
Mao was no less ready for Armageddon than Stalin.
I am very happy that in your reply, the joint struggle of the USSR and China against the Americans is discussed. Undoubtedly, if we are to fight, then we should fight now.
For a few days, Soviet Far Eastern forces were mobilized for war with the West.
Вот так. Мы, вот офицеры, генералы, которые там, мы сидели на чемоданах. Вы знаете, что значит сидеть в военном чемодане? Чемоданы полевые, все с собой, полевая форма, в готовности к броску. Вот так, вот такая реакция была у нас там. Мы чувствовали реальное дыхание войны, но был отбой и успокоили.
In the end, Stalin hadn't been keen to confront a nuclear-armed United States in battle. The two leaders agreed that Chinese troops should go in, not Soviet. Here, the North Koreans and Chinese celebrate the coming battle against the imperialists. Stalin was left on the sidelines, making propaganda.
Результаты одного из боев. Поджигатели войны мечтали, чтобы над Кореей развивался американский флаг с белыми звездами. И вот действительность. В жестоких боях уничтожается техника противника. Окруженный враг вынужден сдаваться.
It was the Chinese who saved North Korea. Stalin's power game in the East had crumbled.
Вот они, американские вояки.
Мао почувствовал себя более уверенно. Он рассуждал так, как я с китайским некоторыми военным разговаривал. Он тогда рассуждал так. Ага, Сталин проиграл, значит, он на второй план уходит. А я восстановил положение, я как победитель теперь там главный. Так оно, собственно, и произошло.
But as the war neared the beginning of its fourth year, everyone's calculations changed.
Течет живая река. Все новые и новые венки несут трудящиеся к гробу вождя.
Такое огромное количество венков, что, кажется, все эти стены были заставлены венками. Тысячи были. Вот этот одуряющий запах цветов, когда я проходил мимо колонного зала, много лет был за мной. Такой, знаете, и цветы, принесенные к гробу, как-то по-особенному пахнут. Смертью пахнут.
Велико народное горе. В глубокой печали проходят перед гробом советские люди.
When Stalin died, communism ruled a third of the world's population and looked ready to rule more. But he failed to leave behind a clear successor. The battle for leadership, not just of the Soviet Union, but of the world communist movement, broke out at his funeral.
When we met the Chinese, they usually ask, Well, if Stalin dies, who will be the leader of the world communist movement? We didn't know.
Zhou Enlai, Mao's right-hand man, came to Moscow for the funeral, while Mao stayed behind in Beijing.
Делегация великого китайского народа во главе с премьером Государственного административного совета Зhou Enlaiем. Преклонив головы перед гробом, они выражают свою скорбь, они выражают свою верность нерушимой дружбе китайского и советского народа.
Мao主席是不是很难过？毛主席我看着也没有十分难过，就是表示勇敢哀悼啊。我们去到一块儿去，到苏联大使馆去。是这样的，因为斯大林逝世以后，什么人接班，这个我们考虑。这个是我们想着毛泽东，想着别人，但是没有想着赫鲁晓夫。
The candidates for Stalin's mantle carried his coffin. The heir apparent was Malenkov. He'd been favored by Stalin towards the end of his life. The new leadership published a photograph in Pravda. For connoisseurs of Kremlinology, it held a world of meanings. Mao stands between Stalin and Malenkov. That is, Malenkov is Stalin's anointed successor, and Mao supports Malenkov. Yet typically, the photo was a fake. At the signing of the treaty 3 years earlier, Malenkov had been a bit part player in the crowd to the right. History had been rewritten to make a political point. Despite Mao's support, Malenkov's position at the summit of the Soviet Union was soon under siege. His main rival was Nikita Khrushchev.
Тогда коммунистический мир как бы не мог обходиться без вождя. Сталин был не только вождем Советского Союза, но и всемирным вождем. Хрущев, как человек, хитрый, если хотите, понимал, что это большая задача – выйти в мир уже как лидер не только Советского Союза, но и мирового коммунистического движения.
Even as Stalin was being stowed in the mausoleum, the new leaders of the Soviet Union got a foretaste of problems to come. The Chinese produced their own picture. It suggested that Mao should take Stalin's place as the leader of world communism.
When Stalin died, they published this poster. You remember this poster? Profiles. Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin. They added Mao Zedong. Moscow didn't react. Other communist parties didn't react. And the Chinese noticed that probably the world communist movement is not ready to admit Mao as the leader of the world movement. So very soon the Chinese took away all these posters. And they never mentioned about it afterwards.
Экспресс из Пекина.
Мы верим, что при теплой помощи советских специалистов мы скоро сможем овладеть знанием по специальности.
The propaganda machine continued to pump out its story of the two leading communist nations striding forward together.
Еще только возводились стены этого гиганта китайской индустрии, а в Москве на Зиле уже владевали профессиями 500 его будущих рабочих, техников, инженеров.
Meanwhile, the leaders were making their calculations.
Я в 1953 году был в Китае. И когда я вернулся оттуда, то вот на нашей даче я разложил какие-то такие подарочки для единственного тогда сына. И утром, когда Хрущев вышел из спальни, за ним заехал Маленков. Тогда они еще дружили. И Хрущев так остановился и спрашивает меня, что это такое? Чашечки какие-то там. Я говорю, это я привез из Китая, вот и для вас тут что-то. Я смотрю, Хрущев задумался и говорит, Егор, он так называл Маленкова, смотри, китайцы что делают, они нас опередят. Значит, тогда уже у Хрущева была мысль, что соперничество начнется. Огромная же страна, 2000 километров границы.
Москва. 14 февраля 1956 года. День открытия 20-го съезда Коммунистической партии Советского Союза.
The 20th Party Congress, 6 years to the day after the signing of the original treaty between the Soviet Union and China, lit the fuse for the conflict. Nikita Khrushchev was now the Soviet leader. In his opening address to the Congress, he lulled his audience with the familiar wooden language.
Товарищи, это один из важных периодов в истории Коммунистической партии Советского Союза, в истории ее борьбы за укрепление могущества нашей Родины, за построение коммунистического общества, за мир во всем мире.
But 5 days later, Khrushchev was to wake the delegates up with a burst of plain speaking. He accused his predecessor, Stalin, of being a criminal megalomaniac. The secret speech wasn't filmed, but it didn't stay secret for long. Its impact was profound.
Ну, зал бы не просто молчал. Вы знаете, я когда смотрел сверху вниз, почти все наклонили голову. Многие держали ладони около глаз. Плакали. И по мере того, как Хрущев говорил этот доклад, начались крики. Позор! Негодяй! Судить!
Khrushchev hadn't calculated the fallout. Most of his listeners had been Stalin's creatures. In attacking Stalin, he was attacking them. The Chinese were particularly incensed.
他们第一没有重视过我们的意见，我们不知道；第二，做的不对，鲁莽，什么你不知道？斯大林怎么讲他是国际人物，不只是关系了你们俄罗斯，还有东欧国家，还有世界其他国家，他对你国家都有影响的。你这样一来，你把其他共产党摆在什么地位了？
He said, what did you do with Stalin? Before making your secret report, you should have consulted all the Communist Party. Stalin did not belong to you. Stalin did not belong to Moscow. Stalin belonged to all of us.
他说，毛泽东说是，任何一个领袖，任何一个领导人，他的缺点错误是应该纠正的。 应该讲明道理，应该说的，这才是应该的，但不是做法，不是你后师傅这样做法，你等着人死了以后你才说，人活的时候你有什么不敢说？
Конечно, он понимал, что, уничтожая культ личности Сталина, он, конечно, развенчивает Мао. И, конечно, он имел в виду, что таким образом он наносит своему потенциальному противнику, кандидату в вожди, очень большой удар. Хотя Хрущев говорил о том, что Мао Цзэдун, может быть, хитрил, очень ругал Сталина. При Хрущеве. Ругал Сталина. Ну, конечно, вся система китайского, так сказать, политического устройства была полной копией сталинской. Тот же тоталитаризм, те же репрессии.
Khrushchev won the mantle of the heroic reformer for his denunciation of Stalin. But he was also trying to strengthen his position as leader, damning his predecessor to build up his own credentials for power. The irony was that for decades, he himself had been one of Stalin's closest lieutenants.
He started a very risky game, because if you want to talk about killers, Khrushchev was one of them, and one of the biggest. He destroyed practically the whole of Ukrainian intelligentsia. But I, as a diplomat, worried more about abroad. What will be the reaction abroad? I knew that it is the end of the world communist movement. I knew.
The first signs of the breakup of the Soviet Empire weren't long in coming. Later in '56, the Hungarians rose up against Soviet control, and Khrushchev had them bloodily suppressed. Rioters in Poland were also shot down. For the Soviets, world communism remained their movement.
从这个匈牙利的事件一直到波兰，他手里掌握了武力，这个军事实力，他用了这个东西，并不是来维护和平，常常是搞霸权的争夺，搞世界霸权的争夺，常常在世界许多地方挑起许多这个事件来。
When Khrushchev suggested to Mao in 1958 that the Soviets and Chinese pool their Pacific fleets, the tensions bubbled up to the surface. Mao angrily rejected the idea as a threat to Chinese sovereignty. So that summer, in July 1958, Khrushchev made a secret visit to Beijing to smooth things over. One day, in the secluded residential area reserved for party bosses in the center of Beijing, Yunnan-hai, Mao and Khrushchev were sitting together by the swimming pool. Suddenly, Mao stood up and went for a swim.
After that, the conversation, they were swimming in the pool. By the way, you have nuclear arms. America is afraid of it. Why don't you provoke a war? Mao asked. And strike America. Khrushchev said, what for? To destroy imperialism forever. Khrushchev said, but what will be the price? Don't care about the price. Khrushchev got curious. We are for control over arms. We are for peaceful coexistence. Peaceful with imperialism? There cannot peaceful coexist. There cannot be peaceful coexist.
The Chinese interpreter at these secret talks was Zhu Ruizhen, then working in the Central Committee, now one of the country's leading experts on Sino-Soviet relations. He disputes the Soviet version.
看到过将来要发生世界大战怎么办？世界大战要死好多人，这个在这个那也这个事情不取决于我们，我们不是帝国主义的参谋长，这个不取决于我们。它真正发生了，你也没有办法。那只好在这个将来这个世界战争结束以后，在这个废墟上再建设我们的社会主义。毛主席讲过这个意思，并没有说叫苏联发动战争，完全没有那个意思。
Khrushchev now saw Mao as a danger to peace. Mao saw Khrushchev as a traitor to communism. Soviet aid had always come with strings attached. Weapons and equipment were supplied, but not the means of manufacturing or repairing them. Mao now argued that China must break free of the Soviet connection, whatever the cost. The split with the Soviets was pushing the Chinese down the road to radical Maoism. Mao's first attempt to make China independent of the Soviets was the Great Leap Forward, a rush to modernize China virtually overnight by popular enthusiasm. Agricultural workers were herded into huge communes or dragged off the land to smelt steel in makeshift furnaces. In Moscow, they were hoping for its failure, but afraid that it would succeed.
Это было воспринято плохо. Вот именно Хрущев лично так отзывался об этом, так сказать, и публично. Вот, о каких там коммунах и о переходе к коммунизму может идти речь. Так, вроде тут Китай даже хочет обогнать Советский Союз, да?
Спор шел о том, кто первый достигнет коммунизма. И поскольку китайцы в 1958 году заявили, что они нашли такой золотой мост, который их с земли поднимет на небо и в небесный коммунистический рай, так сказать, вознесет, и Никита, наверное, в это дело поверил, а это было для него обидно. Как же так? Мы партия Ленина, мы первые совершили Октябрьскую революцию, мы первые построили сельское государство, и вдруг китайцы, которые на много лет после нас только пришли к победе и захватили власть, вдруг они раньше нас войдут в коммунистическое царство. Это для него было, конечно, нестерпимо.
Ну, были такие товарищи, что действительно говорили, действительно, почему, вот китайцы, наверное, правильно делают, зачем топтаться на этой стадии социализма, не пора ли нам так двинуть вперед тоже, вот. Ну, и тогда родилась такая, значит, такой, ну, афоризм, что ли, говорит, ну что же, вы хотите, так сказать, строить тощий коммунист, что ли? Как китайцы тощий коммунист строят, да, вот получил, такой термин появился, ну, в среде, так сказать, нашему плату, вот, тощий коммунизм.
Это была, конечно, глупость, от коммунизма были так же далеки, как и сейчас, и китайцы были далеки от коммунизма, и верить в то, что там возможен этот коммунизм, такой, так сказать, самый, на низкой материальной базе, это невозможно было. И в Советском Союзе это невозможно было.
The Great Leap Forward was a disaster. Food supplies collapsed. The resulting famine led to the deaths of at least 30 million people. In terms of lives lost, the greatest single catastrophe of the 20th century.
Теперь китайские ученые смогут еще более успешно работать в области мирного использования атомной энергии.
At that time, the Soviets were helping the Chinese with their nuclear energy program. But Mao wanted the bomb. When the Chinese asked the Soviets for the bomb components, Khrushchev had second thoughts.
当时就是下决心，就是我们不需要苏联的帮助，我们无论如何要把这个，就是我们再困难，一定要把原子弹造出来。那个。陈毅说过的，没裤子穿一样，原子弹造出。
Andrei Gromyko, the long-serving Soviet foreign minister, was asked by Khrushchev in July 1959 to send a letter to the Chinese. Gromyko turned to Mikhail Kapitsa to draft it. It should describe arms limitation moves with the USA and tell the Chinese that the Soviets could defend them should the need arise. It was an obvious insult.
I didn't protest because you didn't know the Soviet system. When I was reporting to Gromyko, I said, Andrei Andreevich, can we not send this letter to the China? it will have a tragic consequences. Copies you exaggerate. This was his usual. Man, he was a great man, he was a great diplomat, but he was an obedient servant.
我认为这些得有赞同。这个苏联一个国家就能够保卫住其他社会主义国家的利益。历史证明，苏联一个国家常常成为他控制、干涉其他国家的手段，让人家服从于他的利益。我个人认为，主要是他讨好美国，给赫鲁晓夫创造给赫鲁晓夫访问美国创造条件。
In the autumn of '59, Khrushchev went to the USA to talk about peaceful coexistence with President Eisenhower, whom he praised as a man of peace.
Идеи пришли к поезду, чтобы пожать руку Никите Сергеевичу, чтобы сказать ему, так же, как советские люди, мы жаждем мира, и мы надеемся, что ваш приезд поможет этому.
For the Chinese, this visit to the States was a double insult. Not only was Khrushchev talking to the arch-imperialists, he was doing so just when he should have been in Beijing, celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Chinese Revolution.
这是9月份，9月份这也就是赫鲁晓夫又访问美国。访问美国的时候，他讲了一些艾森豪威尔的话，还有一些个呢，就是苏美合作主宰世界。啊。就这一连串的事情，使这个中苏关系的恶化逐步升级。
Во-первых, он и в Америке говорил, что такая это будет, это, знаете, пышность восточная, ему она претила. Вообще такая, знаете, когда надо улыбаться, когда и не хочется улыбаться. И поэтому он опоздал на 4 дня. И, конечно, это была демонстрация. И вот это короткое пребывание в Китае было, по-моему, таким, что утвердило Хрущев мнение, что все, что, так сказать, разрыв абсолютно неизбежен.
1959年他来的时候，在欢迎就比较冷淡，这个他就下来就想拥抱，一个手伸出来，这个毛泽东就只是伸手来握手，没有给他拥抱。
Mao was rejecting the traditional communist protocol established by the Russians of bear hug greetings.
另外，赫鲁晓夫要求这个赫鲁晓夫要讲话，毛泽东没有置欢迎词。
Никита Сергеевич Хрущев передал сердечный дружеский привет ЦК Коммунистической партии Китая, китайскому правительству и всему.
赫鲁晓夫讲话的时候，这个毛主席态度很冷淡，站在那一旁，没有这个很热情的那个表示，没有。
At the parade, they celebrated eternal friendship. But the negotiations were a pitched battle. The Chinese accused Khrushchev of siding with the United States against China. Khrushchev accused the Chinese of being warmongers.
在谈的激动的时候，赫鲁晓夫就是站起来，站起来，在中国方面，陈毅啊、彭真啊，有时候也站起来，有时候这个指着这个鼻子说话啊。后来我们这个会后以后，就大家在议论这件事情的时候，就是赫鲁晓夫像河马一样，一通他就跳。
Khrushchev returned from China in a fury. Soviet leaders were not used to being contradicted.
Khrushchev was extremely talented, but he was ill-bred. He was half beast. And of course, here he started to react.
XX век – это век величайшего расцвета разума, таланта человека.
Shortly afterwards, Khrushchev suddenly withdrew from China thousands of Soviet technical specialists, plunging the Chinese economy further into trouble. It was the beginning of a war of words which led the two countries to the verge of war and divided the communist movement across the world.
Здравствуй, Ван Ли. Я твой сосед по старым плакатам о вечной дружбе. Не получается у нас дружба.
中国是个独立的国家。中国是半殖民地半依赖国，多少年被人家奴役，现在中国站起来了，伸伸腰，可以吧？自己有自己的身份，自己有自己的标准，自己有国家的威信啊，应该有吧？还叫就过去那样的，那行吗？那绝对不行吗？
Прощай, Ван Ли. Пусть преступная клика Мао не столкнет тебя в пучину вражды и ненависти. А если и столкнут тебя, не спеши кричать «Вансуй» и не тычь мне в лицо цитатником. У нас хватит силы выдержки отстоять дело мира и дружбы народов.
The conflict came in many guises. Clashes of national interest, temperamental differences. But they were never the whole story. The ideology taught that communism was the future of mankind. The Soviets thought the ideology belonged to them. The Chinese thought the Soviets had betrayed the true path. For both sides, these were costly claims. The same ideology that justified the existence of their societies also justified the policies that ruined both countries.
This ideology costed us billions and billions and billions. Billions for nothing. Billions for just ideas which practically nobody observed. And finally we stopped to observe.
The Soviet Union's relationship with Cuba in the next programme, next Sunday at the later time of 10:30 on BBC Two.